probably a few Finnish people here, but they helped elect you. So, Jim's career, I said, began in 1963, and when John Blattner became chairman of the Committee for Public Works, Jim became his administrator for the committee, and which later was named Committee for Transportation and Infrastructure. In 1974, when Blotnick announced his resignation, Jim ran and successfully for Congress and for his first term, and later was re-elected for 17 terms, 18 total, including the first one, which was a record for Minnesota for sitting congressman. In the 36 years that Jim served in Congress, he became well known for his expertise in transportation policy. In January 2007, Jim was elected as chairman of the Committee for Transportation and Infrastructure. And during his term, there were almost 200 policies and bills that were approved by both House and Senate, and many of them were very important pieces of legislation. And one example of Jim's influence is when I-35W bridge collapsed. Within hours, Jim drafted legislation, and within 48 hours, to replace the bridge, within 48 hours, there were $255 million that were allocated and approved by both House and Senate, and later signed into law. Although Jim is no longer in Congress, he maintains a very keen interest in transportation policy and shares his expertise with younger generations, new generations, as a visiting scholar at the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. Some of you here were at Humphrey Institute when Ambassador Kieran was here, and you witnessed Jim's involvement and interest in Slovenia affairs and subsequent involvement in Slovenia's independence. So anyway, without further ado, I am very honored and pleased to introduce Jim, and I'm looking forward to hearing his talk about Slovenia heritage.
And congratulations to Miro for his designation by Ambassador Kieran as honorary consul of Slovenia for the United States. Recognition of many years of service to and love for and of Slovenia. I realized I had a sip of coffee. And thank you for participating and for being members of the group of Americans of Slovene ancestry, and for continuing the traditions and spirit of those who emigrated often under very difficult conditions to the United States and brought their Slovene culture with them. It's a very rich heritage, wonderful experience, and it's important for us, first, of course, to be Americans, but to remember whence we came and be proud of our roots and of the contributions that Slovenes have made to America. And if you go back to the very earliest times of the formation of the Union, Thomas Jefferson read the works of the 15th century tradition in what was called at various times Illyria by the French, when Napoleon conquered what is modern-day Slovenia. But it was the Dukes of Carinthia who had developed a tradition that the leader of the peasant people under the domination of the Archduke of Carinthia would have to approve the successor to the Archduke and would have to present himself to the leader of the peasant faction, if you will, who would sit on a capital, as it's called, the top of a column from the Roman era, under a spreading tree, and would receive the Archduke, would kneel before the leader of the peasant, and promise to be honest with the people, to lead them courageously, to be fair in treating their needs and their disputes. And after he made those promises, then the Župan, the leader of the peasant people, would give his approval. And Jefferson saw that as a real expression of democracy and was inspired by it, and kept that passage in his documents, his papers. So our ancestral tradition really shaped the formation of the early United States of America, Declaration of Independence, and of the framing of the Constitution itself, and the very central ideas of democracy. Slovene people, back into the 6th to the 9th century, which is the 6th century is about when the migration from Central Europe, from Central Asia in the Turco-Ugrian plain moved west. And it took a few centuries, but by the 6th century, somewhere between the 6th and the 9th century, they came to what is known as the Pannonian Plain in what is today Hungary. And I tell my Polish and Russian friends, there they came to a sign. And those who could read went south. It became known as the South Slavs. And you have the Eastern Slavs, who are the Polish, Western Slavs, who are the Czech and Slovak, and the South Slavs, or the Slovenians, who then split into Croatian and Serbian. So it's a very long evolutionary history. But at one time, the Slovene power extended all the way up through Central Europe into the Baltic, and dominated what is today Poland, the Czech Republic, and part of Austria. But then came further incursions and invasions, and Slovenes eventually were subjected to the Austrians. And that really begins our modern history. I remember my grandmother, Maria Steve Oberstar, telling me that as a young girl, she and others went to school in Sodražica, which is west of Ribnica, which is south and west of Ljubljana. And in the morning, they had all their classes in Austrian, in German. In the afternoon, they were allowed 1 hour of class in the Slovene language. And so that early immigration wave mixed German and Slovene, because they didn't have a complete education. Most of them were not allowed to go beyond 6th grade. And they worked hard. They were very diligent people. But they realized that there was something better for them than to be subjected to the Austrians, although they didn't have the force, the power to overthrow the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And many were the instances of my grandmother, whose family saved up for 2 years to buy her train ticket. Well, first ox cart from Sodražica to Ribnica, and then horse-drawn cart to Ljubljana, and then the train from Ljubljana all the way across Europe. It must have been an excruciating. I traveled when I was a graduate student at the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. I did a Euro-rail trip, and it took 24 hours to get to Bad Gastein in the Austrian Alps from Bruges. Now, it must have been 2 or 3 days in the 1890s to go from Ljubljana to Le Havre, and then take the steamship from there to Ellis Island. And they had saved up enough for her to have first-class passage. But she was cheated out of it, got on board the ship, and was sent down into steerage. And she said it was a German family, because she could speak German, who took pity on her and let her use their stateroom to shower. And she had long hair down to her knees, and didn't speak a word of English. Now, imagine, she gets off, she and other young Slovene women get off the boat at the dock, and where do they go? And nobody to explain anything to them. But she told this little story as they passed the Statue of Liberty. They stood on deck and they held hands and said, "Budi nam dobra Amerika." Be good to us, America. And America has been very good to us, and Slovenes have been good to and for America. So then her journey was to go across America, having gone all the way across Europe, the Atlantic, and now to go from New York to Minnesota. She had no idea what it was, where it was. It was just someplace way out there. So she and another young woman got on the train, and they were given a little bag with food in it, and she pulled out this thing, bit into it. It was bitter, terrible, awful, yellow, threw it out the window. She had never seen a banana.
Appealing.
And then shortly afterward, there was turned out a Slovene man on board who came to their cabin and said, "Oh, you know, that little bag they're giving you, it's terrible food. You get sick on it. Give it to me. I'll take care of it for you." Unscrupulous person who then went and sold it elsewhere on the train, they learned. But they weathered their way through all those difficulties. They made it to Duluth, and the train was late by 4 or 5 hours, and the person who was supposed to meet grandmother was no longer there. So she talked to somebody else who was going on up to the iron ore mining country. And my grandmother said, "Well, that's better than just staying here in Duluth where I don't know anybody or don't know what to do." And she went on up to Hibbing and got off the train and got to Chisholm. And there, through circumstances, met Alois Oberstar, Louis Oberstar, my grandfather, whom unfortunately I never met. He died before I was born. But he was an oven maker. And all those years I grew up and hearing my grandmother and others saying, you know, in the old country, was the old and the young, they could sleep on the oven. how do you sleep on an oven? And it wasn't until I traveled to Slovenia, to the home of Prešeren, the poet laureate, consolidated, formulated the modern Slovene language, to his home, and I saw an oven. They're huge, about this size, made of glazed brick. And they have like a bench about this size, maybe not quite this tall. And I can imagine sleeping on that little ledge in the winter months when it's damp and cold and occasionally snows. And sure, the old and the young could sleep there. But you have to travel to the country to understand the cultural link and the legacy that they brought with it. So why was an oven maker from Slovenia attracted to come to the United States? Because the steel industry was going through a big expansion. And iron ore had just been discovered. Now there was a stable source of iron ore to make steel. And U.S. Steel was building a steel mill in Duluth. And they needed people to line the steel oven. So where better than to go into Central Europe, where there were oven makers. You could make an oven to bake bread and bake hams and bake wild game. Then surely you could line a steel oven with brick and make it safe for steel production. So they recruited, and Alois Oberstar was one of those recruited. And he made his way and worked in Duluth until the steel mill was completed there, and then he moved to the iron ore mining country, and that's how we got started. And that's somewhat the story of so many of our ancestors who came because they had skills. They had something significant to contribute to this new country. And I retained my fascination with Slovene culture, the language, the music, the dance, the food. Everybody knows potica, but pohanja. How many people know pohanja? Oh, that was a great day when Grandma would make pohanja. And just one other word about this courageous woman. My auntie Patty was just 11 months older than I. Was born at home, as all children were. There were 8 in the family. My father was the eldest. And 3 days after she was born, grandfather was walking up the stairs. He called out, collapsed, he had a heart attack. She went to lift him up. He was a big, tall, strong man. And the pelvic bones hadn't quite set yet. And she dislocated her hip. And she was in excruciating pain for October, November, December. Finally, in December, the only doctor in town said, you have to go to Duluth to have an x-ray. Now, imagine getting in a Model T Ford and driving 90-some miles on a rut-filled road to Duluth. And my father said they poured boiling water into jars, huge jars, the stone jars this size. And by the time you got to Duluth, the water was freezing because it was below zero. Amazing, we were before global warming. And the x-ray showed that the hip had popped out of the socket and was fused to the outside of her hip. And there was no surgical intervention at that time to deal with such a thing. So for 60 some years, she raised 8 children on, so I said at her eulogy at her funeral, on one good leg and a crutch. And bake thousands of loaves of bread, and thousands of loaves of potica, and probably tens of thousands of pohanja, and set an example for all of us, as that generation did, of courage, of values, of tradition. And the regret I have is that I recorded some of her conversations with us. When she saw the microphone sitting on that, she stopped talking. So I didn't get enough of the history, and that's the great regret is that not enough of that was recorded. But it instilled in me and others of my generation, your generation, the love of and the curiosity for and to learn more about Slovenia, which I continued to do over years and over time. And actually, I was at the point of doing a doctorate on the evolution of Slovenia, and took a course in Serbo-Croatian at Georgetown University, and was preparing. Then that was interrupted. I went to Haiti and taught English to Haitians and French and Creole to Americans. But I retained enough of the structured learning of the language to continue to be able to read and follow and pursue things. And then as I began my career in Congress, I followed in John Blotnick's tradition. And maybe just a word about John Blotnick. He was a biochemistry graduate of Winona State University. And in the midst of the Depression, there were no jobs. He eventually worked for the CCCs during the Roosevelt era. Was camp educational advisor at Fensky Lake, north of Two Harbors and just south of Ely, and worked with a generation of very poor kids coming from all over the country, Chicago, Twin Cities, West and East, and then was elected to the state Senate and befriended Dr. E.W. Davis at the University of Minnesota in 1939 and supported his research work on taconite. And John always told the story. He came home to show his father, who worked in the Godfrey Underground mine, where my father worked for 26 years and 15 years in the open pits, and showed him these vials of rock, this gray rock, and then this black powder, and then these gray-black pellets. And he said, father looked at me, he said, Janusz, that's a no ore. Ore is a red. Black is no ore. Never you're going to make something with that. Well, he moved through the state legislature, legislation for tax purposes to treat taconite as a manufactured product to encourage this industry. Tax taconite as any other manufactured good, which launched the industry that has saved the range and has made it possible for us to maintain a domestic steel industry. In World War II, he was parachuted into what is now Slovenia with as chief of the U.S. mission, consisting of John Blotnick, where he befriended the chief of the British comparable intelligence mission. He was in the Blotnick was OSS, and the chief of the British mission was Randolph Churchill. They struck up a friendship. They worked together to rescue American and British airmen who had been shot down on the return from the bombing runs on the German-held Ploesti oil fields in Romania to disrupt the German Nazi war effort. And told of the courage of Slovene people in the countryside. And he would get a message about a plane that was shot down, and crew that had parachuted went to the site, buried the parachute, and the children would walk over their tracks to cover their tracks in the snow so that the Nazis wouldn't know where they are. Hid them in haystacks and barns, and then got them out of the country. Again, courageous work, working with, largely with the partisan group, not the Domobran, who were largely allied with the Nazis, but principally partisan. Later, the young leaders of the partisan movement that Blatnik knew in the war became leaders of post-war Yugoslavia, and when Blatnik traveled to then Yugoslavia to inquire into progress on our foreign aid program, he was granted a meeting with Tito. And Tito told him, I am going to break with the Soviet Union. They cannot suppress me. They cannot suppress the Yugoslavs. We will stand tall against them. And then Blatnik went to NATO headquarters in Paris, told Larry Norstead, who was chief of the mission. Norstead put him on a plane, sent him back to Washington, ushered him into a meeting with President Truman, and Truman was the first one to know that Yugoslavia would break with the Soviet Union. So that's, John Blatnik's contribution was really significant, important, and a true Slovene. He traveled several times to Slovenia, especially after his stomach operation and ulcer. He went there to recover, because Slovene medicine was better at post-op recovery than we were doing in the United States. So I became the heir in the Congress to the Slovene tradition. And the State Department would frequently bring what they called Young Leaders Program. They would find in various countries people in their 30s and 40s in governments such as then Yugoslavia, who had promise for the future. These are going to be the next generation of leadership. And they asked if I would meet with this young man from Slovenia. And of course, he was a member of the Skupština, the parliament. And I said, sure. No, well, just 20 minutes. I said, oh, no, I'll give you a half hour. That's fine. Turned out to be 2.5 hours. 20 years later, Janez Drnovšek was the prime minister of the new Slovenia. We had a 2.5 hour conversation, which he never forgot, and I never forgot. And he awarded me this medal, which is I didn't bring it along. It's a huge, it's about this big. It weighs a couple of pounds. It's the Order of Golden Merit, the highest award that the government of Slovenia can present to any civilian for service to the Republic of Slovenia. And I'm very honored, very proud of it. I also recommended that he present something similar to, in which they did, to Senator George Voinovich, who in later years was helpful with many things with Slovenia. But in addition to those, to that encounter, there started a tradition by the law school of the University of Ljubljana to bring law school students to the United States, to travel to meet law school students in the United States. And I received them in the Rayburn building. We had a subcommittee room where they gathered them, and they were all sort of, the first, it was 4 summers I had these meetings. I could tell they were all tense, they were looking at each other, not quite sure who's the spy in the group, because that was then Yugoslavia. And I would win them over, told them stories I just told you about the early immigrants to the United States, our roots in Novo Mesto or Rivnica or Sodražica or Maribor, and eventually they would warm up. Well, summer of 1990, I went through the same experience, a group about this size. And I said, you know, Slovenia produces 1/3 of the dairy for the whole of Yugoslavia. That's 8% of the population producing 1/3 of the dairy. Slovenes account for 40% of the exports of Yugoslavia. They pay 1/3 of the taxes. 2 million people pay 1/3 of the taxes for a country of 24 million. Don't you think it's time for an independent, free Slovenia? Oh, you could just see them all stiffening up, you know. and I said, if you were given a vote, how many would vote for an independent Slovenia? Well, again, I saw them looking around. Finally, one brave young woman put her hand up. Then another young, it was the young women who did, and then the men in the group started. Pretty soon, all the hands went up. I said, by the end of this year, Slovenia will be independent. I didn't know that, but that's what happened. Then two young leaders, Rupen and Petr, came to see me in September and said, we want to establish the legation. They call it a legation of Slovenia in the United States in Washington, and have a representation. I said, but Slovenia isn't independent. Oh, no. We want to establish a presence for Slovenia here in Washington. Well, I can set you up with meetings in the State Department. They have to approve it, you know. But I guarantee you they won't like this. And I'll tell why in a minute. They came back to see me after the meeting and said, oh, you're right, they don't like this at all. This was the George H.W. Bush administration. And I said, but there's a way to do this. You need a grassroots movement. You need people to stand up and speak for Slovenia. You need to remember the traditions of the Dukes and of the long leadership of Slovenia. When Tito was leader of Yugoslavia, he would always take third world country visitors to Ljubljana and to Lake Bled and to Maribor and show them the riches of Yugoslavia, how progressive this country is. But when first world leaders came to Yugoslavia, he took them to Bosnia, Herzegovina, to Crna Gora, and said, look how poor our country is, we need your help. He was very astute, but he always took the first country to see the best of Yugoslavia, which was Slovenia. And that was the case, and Slovenes realized that they should be. It was long past Tito's death. The rotation of leadership. 1 year, Slovene was chair of the 7 constituent membership group of leadership of then Yugoslavia, and it rotated around and around. It was always the Serbs who wanted to maintain control, and a movement for a referendum was initiated in October, and a voting date was established in December. And frequently I did interviews with the Delo, the largest newspaper of Slovenia, located in Ljubljana. By the way, by 1910 in the United States, there were more newspapers in the Slovene language in the US than in Slovenia. fact, there were more newspapers in the Slovene language in Cleveland than in all of Slovenia. And I did this rather long interview with the reporter from Delo. Why should Slovenia, the question was, why should Slovenia be independent? And what can an independent Slovenia do? And what will it mean for the people of Slovenia? So I went through all those statistics that I just cited a moment ago. You're the country of exports. You are the, among the republics, you're the one that's paying the most in taxes, more than 2 million people, 8% of the population paying 1/3 of the taxes, 40% of the exports, 1/3 of the dairy. You know, they had a front page story, the streets from America. The old uncle from America talking about the Slovene economy and the hardworking people of Slovenia. There, I saw this picture in Delo of main long street with 2x4 posters with the slogan, 2 million sensible heads have nothing to fear from an independent future. Down at the end of the block was another one that said, and 4 million hardworking hands. A little sense of humor, just a little subtle, very nicely expressed, but appealing to their work ethic. The plebiscite was 94% in favor of independence. But it wasn't over. The Yugoslav government, dominated by the Serbs, wanted to keep Slovenia in because if they lose Slovenia, they lose their cookie jar, you know, their money support. It was their bank, it was their footprint on the world. And they had 100,000 troops in Slovenia who tried to take control of the country. But our courageous ancestors, cousins, had stored arms in the mountains in caches, and they had anti-aircraft artillery weapons, and they rolled those out, and they encircled largely the Serb army and said, now you have two choices, die or leave, and we'll let you take your sidearms with you. So they marched out. Of course, they marched through Croatia, doing a lot of destruction on the way. But as uprisings or revolutions go, this one was nearly bloodless. 6 people died. Then the problem was getting recognition by the US government and by European governments. And that was where the problem came in. During the plebiscite, James Baker was Secretary of State, made a statement that was written for him by Lawrence Eagleburger, who was Deputy Secretary of State. Eagleburger had been 3 years in Belgrade as economic counselor at the US Embassy, and then 4 years as ambassador under President Reagan. And when he left, he joined Henry Kissinger's firm as a consultant for Yugo, the Serb-produced automobile, and was closely tied in with Serb financial interests, economic interests, and I said this at the time, so it's not some great secret I'm revealing. And I was outraged that he was in charge of policy, and he wrote the statement for Baker to make that we stand foursquare for a united, integrated Yugoslavia. And I fired a message back to State Department, you should stand firm for American historic principles, for the freedom of people to express themselves and to chart their own course of independence in the world common marketplace. And I continued to make that advocacy, and eventually they backed down, and it wasn't until April of 91 that the United States government recognized the independent Slovenia as a member of the family of nations. Nearly 9-century journey for the Slovene people. And then I continued to be engaged with the new Slovenia, advocating for entry into the European Union. And for my graduate studies at the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium, many of my classmates were either in the, there were only 35 of us, but they were all PhDs. I was the only one there with an undergraduate degree. But this was at the time of the formation of Europe. So they went on to positions in the ministries of the European Union, in the directorate in Brussels of the European Economic Community. And so I talked to them, appealed to various people to accept and bring their national governments and the European Union government together in support of admission to Slovenia into the European Union. And that too happened in 93, 94, and then Slovenia wanted, it was a major public policy issue to be admitted to NATO for a number of reasons. Well, one of them was a very curious thing. I found out that the United States had provided a concessionary sale of military helicopters for the Slovene armed services. 6 very advanced, high quality, but no helmets. So no communication. You have all the communication. The headset is all in the helmet. They wouldn't let them buy the helmet because those were high tech and they could be used in an aggressive conflict. This is crazy. The Slovenes aren't planning war against anybody, And eventually, I arranged a meeting of the Slovene Minister of Defense come and meet with Les Aspin, who had served in the U.S. House from Wisconsin, very good friend of mine. I actually supported his campaign and in the House to be chair of the Armed Services Committee. Now he's Secretary of Defense under Clinton. And get the Slovene Defense Minister, receive him. Make it a big deal. They had an event at Blair House. It was really terrific. And finally, the U.S. led the way for Slovenia to be included in NATO. And suddenly that challenge to having helmets and helicopters went away, and they were all buy equipment and modernize their services. But the Slovenes were very quick to denationalize major industries, the banks, and their airline, Adria Airlines, which now has a code share with Lufthansa. And I participated in working that out and working an agreement for them to buy 737s from Boeing and ultimately Airbus from Airbus Industry in France. And there is now a major maintenance facility at the airport in Ljubljana, where a Slovene-trained group does maintenance for Lufthansa's 737, A320, A319 fleet that is the best in all of Europe, and where Lufthansa brings other maintenance providers to the facility in Ljubljana to be trained in proper maintenance of aircraft. Well, then it was in 1995 that President Milan Kučan, Miro, you're probably the only one who can read this in Slovenian, but invited me to come. I offer you my warm greetings to express my hope that you are well and enjoying success in performance of the duties delegated to you by your constituency. that entails a very busy schedule, although this is certainly not a burden when followed by good results. When we met, we discussed the possibility of you visiting Slovenia. Coming months would be ideal for these plans, and I would like to invite you to be my guest in Slovenia and see for yourself the way of life in our still young country. I look forward to receiving your reply. Stay in touch with Ambassador Petric. You let him know your wishes regarding the time and duration of your visit. Aides will do the best to make your stay in Slovenia as pleasant as possible. It couldn't have been more pleasant. And Ambassador Petric was the first ambassador of Slovenia to the United States. Dr. Petric, PhD in history, professor at the University of Ljubljana, distinguished scholar. And he came they had no embassy facility. There was no residence for the ambassador. He had to establish everything. And of course, came to the how should I say, the Slovenia in America, my office in Rayburn Building, and said, help, where do I start? and I said, you know, the name Petric is very special in our town. John Petric was our oil delivery man. He delivered fuel to our house.
Good contact.
So I'm going to help you, you know, we developed a warm relationship. I had him and his wife to our home for dinner several times. He finally had me come and look at it. What do you think about this place? It's up near DuPont Circle, an old townhouse. It was in not very good shape. So well, it's going to need a lot of paint. You're going to need refurbishing of these rooms. You have to make this look welcoming, to look like it's a serious place for a serious new presence on the world stage. He went there on weekends with a bucket of paint and roller and rolled the walls, painted the walls. You know, no other embassy, no other country would do it. Only the Slovenes. You got a job. Well, someone has to do it. That someone is me. Hardworking Slovenes. Save money for the country. You know, it's just. So I of course accepted President Kuchan's invitation, and my wife and I traveled. And when he said, we will make your stay as pleasant as possible, they put us up in the residence that Tito had built. It's real Soviet style, you know, low, slung, gray, grim, but nice interior. Tito had built for visiting dignitaries, leaders of other countries, and a spectacular view out on the Brda, over a hill overlooking Ljubljana, and fresh in the morning, got nice coffee and juice, little pastries, breakfast, and then toured the whole country. Had a helicopter tour, stopped in various places, saw how the woodworking is very important, furniture making very important in Slovenia, export of furniture. But they don't do clear-cut logging. Go with a helicopter, take one tree out, and bring it down the hill. And they cover that place up and plant another tree in its place immediately. And if there is a heavy rain and a washout, the people mobilize themselves and with sacks on their back put the soil in these little wicker baskets and march back up the mountain, put the soil back in place, plant something on it to prevent it from eroding again. As we traveled north from Ljubljana to Maribor, I noticed a couple of farmhouses, that one of which had a roof tile out of place. We came back, that tile was back in place again. You know, the meticulous care. Interpreter with me, and I went and said, Dobro več. Jaz sem Slovenac, ali ne govorim dobro slovenski jezika. I'm Slovenian, but I don't speak the Slovene language very well. And I talked about the performance of the evening, wonderful. And I said, now, I grew up knowing the various regions of Slovenia, but there was a story, there was a song about Steiersko, and how the people of Steiersko are so welcoming and so friendly. And so I see that now. I see that here in this place. And that song was Gremo na Štajersko gledat kaj delajo, ljubice tri. I won't go with the rest of it. The place stood up and applauded. 2,500 people stood up and applauded. They were so excited. Then my wife and others were sitting way in the back. Someone turned around, how come our politicians don't get up and sing like that? So the cultural ties are there, the country is strong, they are doing well. Sort of moving out of this, early on this was this sense of, we're just this little country. And Rogaška Glassworks, which makes the most beautiful glass, pure, I had the opportunity to visit the glassworks itself, where they're hand blown. Magnificent cups and glasses and wine goblets and other works of art, and they sell them under the trade name Mikasa, which is Japanese, Waterford, which is Irish, and a couple of other. I said, why don't you market these under Rogaška? Oh no, you stick your head up too far, you get it cut off. That was 10 years ago. Now they're marketing, they have a Rogaška Glassworks outlet factory, outlet store in New York City. And it's marketed all around the country. The wines of Slovenia, of course its nickname is the sunny side of the Alps, but the calcareous soil is like that of Bordeaux of France, and the moisture, the drainage is just right, produces high quality, very, very high quality wines. Why don't you export? I remember one vintner said, it's too nice to export. Why would we give it away?
They know how to drink it themselves.
They know how to drink it themselves. But now in increasing quantities, the real reason was they didn't have volume of production, and now Slovene wines are making their way into the U.S. marketplace. In the northern part of Slovenia, on the Austrian-Italian border, is a little town of Kobarit, which is Caporetto in Farewell to Arms of Hemingway. And in Kobarit is a museum on the history of warfare, 2,000 years of history. And as you walk through this, there are dioramas that show the borderland in 200 meters of 2,000 years of history. 1 million people died. And they have letters written by Roman legionnaires who were found frozen in the ice. They have other artifacts, and they've recreated the message with voice. You can either put headphones on or there's a loudspeaker, plays those back. And it just occurred to me that if you could run the leaders of the world through this place, to see the torment, to see the horror of war, to see how futile it all was, maybe we might not have war in the future. Much to learn from Slovenes. And in Ljubljana is the Landmine Museum. A group began, just volunteers, clearing landmines in Slovenia. were left with the exit of the Yugoslav army. And then as warfare ended in Croatia, in Bosnia, and Herzegovina, there were landmines, millions of them, everywhere. Children were losing a leg and an arm, and farmers were afraid to plow their fields because the equipment was blowing up. So Slovenes began a landmine clearing initiative. And I secured funding through the foreign aid program of $10 million a year to support that initiative. Had support from a Republican in California, Elton Gallagher, and then I engaged Senator Voinovich and Senator Harkin, whose mother was Slovene, to support us over there. The result is that in 15 years, over 20 million landmines have been removed. Hundreds of thousands of acres have been cleared and safe for people. And one of the extraordinary things, and what the group, the International Demining Institute, it's called, this group does is go into, say, Bosnia, and train people locally. So the Slovenes aren't doing it for them, they're just supervising the work to be done. Train them in landmine removal to do it so that there's no loss of life, no loss of dogs. But they had this brilliant idea, training bees. They fed bees infinitesimal amounts of the chemicals common to the explosives in the landmines, and increased the until they would then release the bees who would come and hover over the place where the landmine is. And then they could remove the landmine without danger. And in this museum they have the history of landmines, including one that they discovered in 98, 99, in the waters just off Postojna. From World War I, it was a water built by the Germans, still functional. A ship hit it would explode. They built things very good, the Germans did. But that's, that is a little known story about our ancestors, our cousins of today, Slovenia, caring about the world, about doing something good and permanent and lasting. We're all inheritors of that tradition, and something to be enormously proud of. Thank you all for continuing. So.
I have a question. Your memories, it's delightful and unique. It's a shame that so few people heard you. Would you consider putting that on paper and come next year and have a exciting story? What say you?
Well, people are often asking me to write a book about transportation. I don't know how to do that, but that's. I have lots of notes. It's something I will work on. Thank you for the suggestion.
No, I think it would be very useful. I remember, I'm familiar with about a third of what you spoke about. I lived there for 7 years.
Yes.
So I would be, you have unique experiences to put that on paper. So please do it.
I'll work on doing that. There's another, not a your question, but as we drove north from Ljubljana, I saw these fields with A-frame and something growing on them. I asked the driver, what is this? Oh, that's hops. I had never known that hops were grown on wires strung like this. And so, they hang down, and they're about finger length. And hops from Slovenia are used in Bavaria, in Belgium, in elsewhere in Germany, as the prize hops for making the best beer. Good question.
I was very interested in your comments on how they, in the forests, they don't do clear cutting, to thin out the forest. If a tree has to come out, it comes out. I'm wondering if there can be, well, I inherited part of the forest. I had to do some research on this, and I found out Slovenia has the largest preserved forest after Norway and the Black Forest. It's the third largest preserved forest in Europe,
Right.
after these two other big forests. Can we import some of their non-clear cutting forestry methods in this country? I mean, do a reverse cultural exchange in the sense that they're doing it, oh, the forest is just magnificent in Slovenia and it covers so much of the country. How come we're not importing some of their methods to keep our forests so vibrant?
It would apply to the western forests, but Slovenia is 10,000 square miles. It's about the size of St. Louis Lake and Cook counties
Right.
in northern Minnesota. It's 80% mountains. I said to President Kuchar, if you flatten Slovenia out, it would be as big as Germany. But it's because of the mountainous terrain that they do this individual timber harvesting. And in some of the western forests, that would apply, but there has been the effort in the Forest Service to do what is called selective timber harvesting, and it runs into enormous contrary lobbying because the big timber companies want the clear cut. What happened to northern Minnesota? We don't have that mountainous terrain, but the rape of the white pine forestry of northern Minnesota, those trees have never recovered. Well, I see Jerry Sparling, who has been my scheduler for 12 years, and whom I've retained to continue doing my schedule, keep me on track, get me meetings like this. He's here, and it's always a sign I have to go.
Jim, on behalf of the entire group, I want to thank you. Najlepša hvala. You make us proud to be Slovenians or connected to Slovenia in any way.
Hvala lepa.
All without one note. He didn't even have a note card. And he did how much an hour, eh? Wow. Excellent.
Well,